Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 2020 Sam Sharpe Lectures. Hope you're comfortable on this chilly night. My name is Rosemarie Davidson-Gotobed. I am the founder of the Sam Sharpe Lectures and coordinate it alongside Revd Wale Hudson-Roberts. Ladies and gentlemen, you are in for a treat this evening. This lecture has been 2 years in preparation, and I have it on good authority that wide consultation has taken place. The person who will be chairing our evening is the Dr. Dulcie McKenzie. Dulcie is the director of the Centre for Black Theology at Queen's Foundation, Birmingham. As a theological educator, she has a particular interest in the Caribbean Pentecostal music history and womanist theology. Dulcie, like many of us, is British born and of Jamaican heritage and grew up within the African Caribbean Pentecostal tradition. After a long career in radio and broadcasting, and her strategic role educating the next generation of Black theologians in Britain, Dulcie has been named by Keep the Faith magazine as one of the UK's most inspirational Christian women making an impact in 2019. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dulcie to the forum. Welcome, Dulcie. Great to see you.
Thank you, Rosemarie, and thank you for that lovely welcome and introduction. I'm really happy to be the moderator for this year's annual Sam Sharpe Lecture, and I want to extend a big welcome to everyone joining us this evening. We are streaming live across the world, and everyone is welcome. The Sam Sharpe Lecture has been an annual event for some 9 years now, and it is a celebrated event that comes during Black History Month. But it comes this year during a global pandemic that has devastated lives. It also follows the death of George Floyd, who died at the hands of police in America. And it must be said that he was not the first to be killed by police, and we have already seen that he will not be the last. But like never before, has there been an appetite, even if only short-lived, to talk about racial injustice and Black lives. And the global debates and protests has helped to highlight even more ongoing inequalities and social injustice, especially for people of African descent. Nearly 200 years ago, Sam Sharpe, a Baptist deacon, was inspired by his faith to act against injustice. And as an enslaved African in Jamaica, he used his position as a religious leader to try and bring about change. But his actions cost him his life. And it wasn't until many decades later that he was first recognized as a national hero in Jamaica. And here in the UK, each year, the Sam Sharpe Lecture honors his life. So this year's annual lecture comes to us by Pentecostal Bishop Wilton Powell, OBE, who is the former National Presiding Bishop of the Church of God of Prophecy in the UK and France. He served as a bishop for over 30 years, and during that time, he was involved in various projects to provide social welfare. Projects like the Nehemiah Housing Project for the homeless. He was a leading advocate for an international development to tackle poverty. He also was a founding member and a chair of RAFA, an international development agency charity set up to assist people in Africa, the Caribbean, and Europe. This evening's lecture was recorded earlier. So after we have watched it, we will have the opportunity to speak with Bishop Powell in a Q&A. So during the lecture, please feel free to make comments and ask questions in the chat facility as you listen. That will be your way of communicating with us throughout the evening. And after the lecture, we are anticipating a good conversation with Bishop Powell and hoping that you will provide the type of questions and topics to cover. Please also know that you can also tweet at Sam Sharpe Prog, #StaySharp. The title for this year's lecture is Man Against the System. And Bishop Powell asked a significant question. How on earth did Sam Sharpe, an enslaved Jamaican Baptist deacon, help to dismantle an oppressive system that was endorsed by Queen and country, and in the process overturned laws that were designed to dehumanize Black lives. Let's hear now Bishop Wilton Powell.
Thanks for this invitation to speak, to deliver the Sam Sharpe Lecture 2020. I consider it an honor and indeed a privilege to be given such an auspicious occasion to speak on a subject that touches all our lives, whether we are from the Caribbean, Africa, or Europe. It touches the very shaping of our society. And I hope that this evening I may be able to do justice to a subject such as this. But before I proceed, I shall give due recognition to Revd Lynn Green of the Baptist Union, Revd Karl Johnson, the Jamaican Baptist Union, Reverend Wale Hudson Roberts, and also the Sam Sharpe Society of the United Kingdom. I would wish to recognize also those persons who have assisted me in preparing this work, Church of God of Prophecy National Offices, and all the other administrators who have enabled me to deliver this lecture today. For me, this has been quite an occasion because Sam Sharpe's struggle, his life, touches the very core of who we are at this present time. During the last 400 to 500 years, our world has been developed in an unparalleled way in all human history. We have seen developments that are beyond belief in many ways. We have seen our society being shaped in dimensions that we had never ever imagined. As we contemplate this issue today before us, we must first do a reflection on those who have preceded us historically. We see prominent figures such as Rex Nettleford, Professor Hilary Beckles, Dr. Eric Williams, and also Professor Sherlock and Bennett, Dr. Bennett, and several other prominent figures in the Caribbean and also on the world landscape who have spoken and acted in a way as to enable us today to be informed. Therefore, I believe that collectively we are standing on their shoulders, and by God's grace, we'll be able to advance this subject further today. I want to acknowledge prominent speakers who have preceded me in several years. Dr. Reed Salmon. I also recognize Professor Varian Shepherd and many others who have spoken, eminent speakers who have occupied this chair and have delivered eminently during the years. As I've said before, the last 500 years has been epic in human development. First slide. We have witnessed a human architecture in a magnitude that has never been known in all the history of mankind in this world. We have seen an ascendancy of a political order in Europe which has shaped our world. In recognizing the political, the economic, the religious, technological, and other factors which has created the European civilization. A world empire which aims to produce a society which enabled mankind to live, to act, and to do things that have never been done before. Within that development, clearly there is the Reformation. Reformation essentially is a religious development that took place in Europe. The church, the Reformed Church, and the historical church taking a division and avenues, if you will, placing new attitudes, new perspective of worship, new perspective of seeing, belief, and acting in God. There is also in the Renaissance the technological and other developments which accompanied the Reformation. We have seen also the political framing of an ideology which enabled the society to see itself in a new avenues and to act in new ways. This creates a new civilization. This creates avenues by which Europe saw itself in new terms. And in fact, we may recognize it as a new architecture, a new political architecture, a new societal architecture, which enabled mankind to look at himself in a new and purposeful way. It enabled him strategically to formulate the ideas whereby he assumed a mastery in nature. He was able to preside in a way that man has never been able to exert before. He saw himself as a master, so to speak. And then that mastery gave him an authority which he exerted. He created new ideas, new machineries, new thoughts, and all of that came together in a systematic and strategic way that gave him a sense of liberation. So as we proceed today, we will look at how the formulation of this architecture gave the European a perception of himself, and we may say a superior perception among mankind. Although he has depended on the Greeks, the Romans, the Chinese Empire that had preceded him, but yet, in a way, during this period of time that we are considering in this lecture, there has been a distinct shift in the manner in which he has exerted himself in nature and the things that he has done in order to develop this new world that we are contemplating. In fact, we may even go as far as to say the new political architecture which he presided over could be considered to be utopian in concept. And as much as men such as Rousseau, Locke, Hume, and others who have helped to frame the political thought that shaped the modern Europe, there was an alternative society which was created in the Caribbean. And in fact, I should even say that we have seen the enabling of this society, a mass transportation of humanity across the Atlantic into the Americas and the Caribbean in a mass industrial way that clearly has never ever been done in all the history of man. It gave a perspective in terms of achievements. It gave an outlook, a sense of value, a sense of purpose, a sense of being driven, and also a sense of acquisition of wealth, of property, which has never been done before. In this endeavor, we see that the purpose, the will to acquire, to control, to exert himself, the European exerting himself above others, clearly became a distinct trait of this new development. But in order for us to gain some foresight or some understanding of what is happening, this new political architecture in Europe clearly identifies itself as a superior reality, a new form of existence. And I will use as a thesis as I pursue this lecture today, is that the European believed that Western civilization, stroke culture, was superior to that of the African culture. And there was a tension between it and the Judeo-Christian perspective, which sustained an elder view that all men were created equal by God. And it is that tension that we will develop today. It is that tension that we'll try to explore to understand how Europe developed a system, an empire based on race, class, and power to the disadvantage of another set of people, Africans, who were subordinated and was held as in subservience to themselves as a matter of wealth, as a matter of gaining advantage in the advancement of their cause in Europe. As we look at this, we can see that the idea of pursuing and transportation of Africans was, according to Sherlock and Williams, they were chosen because it was felt that they were subservient. They would produce a high quality labor. And in the subservient means that they will be managed and controlled in a way that will produce an advantage. In other words, there was an economic consideration which was given to their thoughts as they proceeded here. And also in looking at this, we must also see that there were boundaries, there were clear boundaries with European thinking. As much as Locke, Rousseau, Hobbes, and all of those others had thought that they thought about a development of a society for mankind, it clearly did not include the African. He was seen as property. And as we pursue this lecture today, it clearly will be seen that Sam Sharpe was a man who felt that he was not property. He was an intelligent being. He was able to do as other men. He had acquired a European culture. He behaved in ways and manners which enabled him to function as a European. But because of his color, because of his origin and his posterity, he was denied his humanity. He was placed in a society which Sherlock and Bennett described as brutish, based, and greedy. In other words, a slave society was brutish, based, and greedy. And here was a man who was bounded by someone else, was physically bounded in terms of his treatment as a slave, but also intellectually, socially, and all the other aspiration of man. He was bounded, he was kept separated and treated as an alien. His inalienable rights, as Rousseau had argued, was clearly violated. This society was designed for profit. This society was designed to enable for his race, for his class. And because of the power that was exerted by the metropolitan power, the European culture, they felt they had the resources to extract his labor at no cost. That is the contention of this lecture today. So here we find two societies in tension, a European metropolitan power and a slave society. And as Beckles pointed out, a slave society was a society of non-entities, a society which meant that Sam Sharpe and his fellow men had no identity other than the person who possessed them, and served accordingly, and were required to obey, and they were treated as equivalent to animals. There was no distinction. And the inhumanity of that society was never felt to be a breach of divine sanctions. In other words, the church accommodated the brutality that was imposed upon that society. And it must be seen and understood that this argument of the treatment of Africans was a purely economic argument. It was nothing other than Europe wishes to advance itself in employing its technology, employing its knowledge and all the other gain from the Renaissance in a way that enabled them to advance in the world order, in a way that enabled them to function beyond other men. So going forward, we can see that the idea of superiority became a governing instrument. The racial superiority became a governing principle. A man was subordinated because he was of another race. He was chosen to perform a labor because he looked differently, acted differently, and it was deemed only worth to labor other than anything else. We could see, for example, when within the American Constitution, where it states quite clearly that all men were created equal, but yet Negroes were treated as 3/5 of a human being. And although the Constitution stated that Negroes were equal, but yet in their institution, they were treated as less than human in order to accommodate their desire, their human desire, and because they had the power to make the changes. To move your conversation forward, you notice is that wealth flowed from the Caribbean. And that wealth that came to Europe enabled it to succeed. It created new industries. It created a new way of life in shipping, within the towns, the steel plants, in the fabric, in manufacturing of fabrics, manufacturing of roads, all the necessary infrastructure that was needed for the enabling of a modern industrial society was essentially gained from the Caribbean sugar manufacturing processes. And this country became developed essentially by that factor, and by able to enabling and financing the new development. We can see in the videos such as Adam Smith and others who looked at the system, because the marketing of all in the triangular trade, in other words, slave from Africa into the Caribbean, into the Americas, shipping sugar back to Europe, formed a triangular trade. It became a very profitable triangle. But yet, as the development took place, it was noticed that the restrictive practices of the monopoly that existed of the navigational laws, there clearly needed to be an expansion. Because, and remember, by the way, in the wider environments of our world was a revolutionary world. In Europe, there was a revolution in France. The American colony had broken away. In 80, there was a rebellion. And so therefore, we had a world that clearly was in turmoil, a world that was developing and moving in new directions. So this brought people, African in the Caribbean, with an aspiration for deliverance. And let me say this, right from the beginning, there clearly was, when the British had captured Jamaica, there was a residue of Maroons that were left who fought the British, and the British had an accommodation with them by establishing a protectorate, establishing a small state, if you will, in the Maroon territory that enabled the slave trade to function without hindrances. So therefore, there's always been that degree of resistance to European presence. There's always been an underlying resistance to the slave industry. There's always been that sense of identity that need to be asserted. So therefore, from this came a sense of unrest. And throughout the Caribbean, there's always been rebellions. But particularly in Jamaica, there has been about 8 rebellions in Jamaica. And this was essentially based on the fact that right from the beginning, the British had captured Jamaica. Resistance was there, and there were people who had never been subdued. But moving forward, I wish to point out that the development that flowed and the trade that flowed from the Caribbean, from Africa, Caribbean, from those territories, brought Britain into a new world economically, and Adam Smith captured the thoughts and the concept of a developed economy. The development of Britain also meant that the profitability of the Caribbean waned, and there were shifts that were now taking place, and the abolition had now come into play. The abolition essentially sprung from several strands, as I've said to you before. Came from the fact that Britain had now become a modern economy. They are now industrialized. They have gained the cities, the roads, ships, and various other things were now a part of the British. And Britain was the first industrial economy throughout the world. This was an advantage and also a disadvantage. First of all, the profitability of the sugar industry went down. The rebellions went up. So therefore, the popularity of the planters waned throughout this time. It meant that the view that individuals had of the use of the plantation clearly was going. And now we are seeing that there's a shift that's taken place. The resistance, Sam Sharpe, what held that view of his humanity, must be asserted, became strong. There's also other territories, India, Brazil, Cuba, and other places. Sugar manufacturing was now increased to an extent where Jamaica became a very small place. And the industrialization of Britain, steam engines, steamships, and various other things that were being done in Britain meant that they needed to expand the markets on a global level. Therefore, the abolition forces came into play. We hear of a Wilberforce, now the men in parliamentary system. We have the native Baptists in Jamaica. We have the Baptists from the United Kingdom. And all of those other, and also the regular people within Britain, within the society of Britain, also objected and were embarrassed by the slave trade, because the sense of holding men in captivity and utilizing their labor, there was a contrast, because now Britain had an industrial society. And there was a notable speaker who said that the slaves in Britain was enabling the society in Britain to enslave those individuals there. So therefore, that was an argument for liberation. So moving forward, we could see that as a prime argument for the abolition, which ultimately occurred. And that meant that a world which started on the back of the Africans who supported and provided all the necessary means for development were now in place. So the tensions, and I should explain a little bit more, but the Baptists were the people who stood and held that biblical view clearly. The native Baptists, originated by Moses Baker, the British Baptists, who also supported that view. And they stood with Wilberforce and others who clearly argued for the abolition. Now, as we go forward, we can see that the changes have taken place. But the established church has not participated, and the established church had still held to the original view. And in fact, were party to it. So the perceived superiority of the European over Black people have led to the past atrocities and humanity of the slave trade. And all this was carried out while the church at the time stayed silent and in some ways were complicit with what had happened. Today we find that there is a racism, oppression, and Black people in the United States and other countries and around the world. And still today, the church continues to remain silent in the midst of racism and oppression. In reality, what has changed? Where are we? Where are we now? Where are we now? The argument of the past has been clearly an argument of exclusion. Institutions have been clearly deeply impacted by the idea of superiority. In industry, the institution of law, the institution that regulates all manner of a developed country. The country that came from, and we can move on to decolonization, the countries that were decolonized were less developed than the Europeans. They have never been a thought given to have a systematic development of those countries that were colonized. So I'm here speaking about exclusion. The countries that have been colonized was essentially excluded from the Western capital system. Capitalism had excluded the African people as active participants, other than pure labor, other than being on the margins, other than they have never been given those equipment and resources to be fully participant within the society. Therefore, we must consider that going forward warrants a sense of inclusion. Where are we going, and what is necessary to be done? That we're moving to an argument of inclusion. Costas, Orlando Costas speak about the dialogue at the crossroads. He talks about the interaction of cultures and the dialogue at the crossroads. And I think Rex Nettleford also used this concept in his decolonization discussions. We today clearly need to review our history. We need to, in dialogue, in a sense of reconciliation, with a sense of understanding, engage with our host countries. The European powers should, with a matter of conscience, with a matter of reality, acknowledge that they have perpetrated, it could be terms of crimes of humanity that needed to be addressed. European powers have not, in a wholehearted way, looked at the issues that have flowed from slavery and its consequences, including the United States. We have seen how the enslaved people were marginalized and how the law has been used to exclude them from being full participants within the society. I do believe that there has to be structures created for us to re-examine our history, to look constructively at the dialogue, at the avenues of how we will communicate across the boundaries, that our children and grandchildren, and also the European societies truly come to terms with the issues of the enslavement of African people. For them to recognize that the damage that has been done should clearly be confronted. I therefore believe that there should be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission which should be set in place that explore that. I believe also that the church should be the church, the established church, the historical church, and all Christian believing and others of goodwill should participate in a sense of enabling and doing what is required to confront this historical issue. I do believe that it is not possible for us to speak of ecumenism in any real sense of the word if we do not confront these issues. And I am working with the leadership of the Black-led churches who are now actively pursuing avenues for developing the historical pathways to inform our community, both Europeans and non-Europeans, of the history of the African people as they have been treated in the West. We do believe that this is a necessary for development. We do need it for reconciliation. We do need it for understanding, because it's by doing so that we are able to confront the issues and we can have peace in our societies. We can then look at how we proceed forward. How can we have Britain now being the center of world finance, and yet we who have been at the very source of which much of this has been established, the banking system, the insurance system, the financing of the industrial system, and all of those things that have been done through our labor. Three, I think it is Adam Smith who spoke about the labor of man carries value. Why should it be that the labor of the black man is extracted and is considered value to him, to others, but not value to the European himself? Reparation is another issue which clearly must be considered, because the development of a nation demands history. And when slavery was abolished, there was an economic stimulus given to the planters. What today values would be several billions. But there's been no stimulus given to the Africans, wherever they may be, whether in the United States or the Caribbean or anywhere else. We must, as a matter of justice, as a matter of going forward, I realize that this presentation is a mere initiation of a major debate, a global debate. The transportation of the African was a global conversation. And the treatment and the resolution of these matters are global in their magnitude. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Wilton Powell. You have called your lecture Man Against the System, and it was recorded just shortly earlier. Is there anything you would like to add whilst we are here before we continue with some questions to you?
I do believe that the conversation has moved in the last 60 years, particularly with the Caribbean people coming to England or to Europe. And they are now integrated with this population. And the issues of the Caribbean are now a part of British history and British society. And the heritage of the people who are here, who are connected with the Caribbean, we have divided families. And I do believe as we look towards resolving the issue of the historical Caribbean people, we must now contemplate how do we resolve these mixed heritage families who has to make decisions in looking which side of the fence do I go. If I'm light complexion, I'm acceptable. If I'm dark, I'm related to the other side. These issues must be regarded. But clearly, as I speak of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I believe that there clearly needs to be a confrontation of the issue in a spirit of reconciliation, examining the past with a sense of realizing that there was a humanitarian consideration in terms of inhumanity rather than anything else that's been happened there. And we ought to collectively confront this issue, because the church must be the conscience of the nation. And by so doing, we are reflecting truth.
So some of the points you just mentioned there, Bishop, we want to pick up, but just to remind everyone to please send your questions or comments in the chat facility. We will be here for another 5-10 minutes or so, but please do get in touch with your question. Bishop, I want to pick up that last point that you mentioned there, that reconciliation involves everyone. What might that look like?
First of all, and I want to use myself as an example. When I looked at the work of Eric Williams, Dr. Eric Williams, it was when I was about 60 years old. And I wondered to myself, how can I be studying all my life and I've never realized that British capital, the establishment for the modern society here, was depended so much on the wealth that flowed from the Caribbean. And the establishment of a modern industrial economy, or a political economy, as it is described, Adam Smith's words, depended on that. And the transformation of the society meant that the restrictive practices of what is called the navigational laws had to be removed in order for Britain to experience and receive the full potential of the new economy that has happened here. And I've never known that until, and I do believe that that knowledge should not be secluded. And in fact, Williams's work was largely excluded from the British history, and it was in the United States that it was published. And as Marcus Garvey did try to do, he tried to move back to this country so as to engage with the international communication of utilizing that issues of slavery. And I believe that we ought to develop the same strategy.
We've got one question that's come through that's asking, I believe the mainstream church must acknowledge the basic biblical premise of the equality and unity of mankind that counters the narrative of racial segregation and supremacy. What would you want to say about that?
To articulate a point of view and to incarnate the idea that flows with it is two different things. To articulate a point of view, demand is much less of a demand than for it to become incarnated in my ways, in my action, and in my deeds, in the institutions that are within the society. And if we are to project a faith which is unified, we clearly need to incarnate the ideal. And at the moment, the silence of the church speaks volumes to the fact that we have not yet reached a place that the value of humanity, the oneness of humanity, the oneness of the family of man, we are at that place as yet. And that silence still speaks to us in a magnitude that is unacceptable.
In your time as bishop of one of the historic Black majority churches here in the UK and France, what have you done and your congregation in relation to that silence?
In regards to the connectivity across the landscape, I've ensured that I build bridges. I've worked with Joe Aldred and others in terms of promoting the pathways of building bridges to communicate with the established and historical churches. And I believe that is a start, because if we are not in touch with each other, it's difficult to be able to speak when you are not communicating or to convey values and ideas. So that's a preliminary position. But clearly, there's work that has been done. But we must continue. It's small, it may be, but yet we have got to continue that pathway, on that pathway.
Here's a question on that note. Should the higher churches, so-called, such as Anglicans and Baptists, join the call for reparation?
I think they must first acknowledge that they have participated and they are beneficiary of slavery. It is clearly, Beckel's work has demonstrated that clearly. This is why I've cited the idea of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because I feel that if we confront the issues of slavery in the purest sense, we will then realize that they received a stimulus with the planters. The church received a stimulus with the planters when the dismantling or the abolition of slavery came about. And I feel that those are issues that clearly need to be addressed before we move to that reparation. And I feel that if we can acknowledge that and then act in unison, then reparation flows from that, because I believe that we need to work together in order to deliver reparation.
So on that then, how do the churches go beyond mere words to action?
Well, this is that by the endeavor that we are pursuing this evening is a first. We need to speak clearly, and we need to say to the churches that ecumenism will be a mere word if we do not look at the deeper issues of the unity of man which clearly was violated when they participated in slavery.
I wonder, Bishop, if we can contemporize the conversation beyond the church in light of the George Floyd murder and the global protests and global debates. What does the church have to say about that? Because some would accuse the church, your own church and other Black majority churches, for example, and the church per se, being very silent.
Oh, well, I'm not excluding myself when I said in some elements we are clearly silent. And in fact, the things that we do, we tend to do it quietly and in many respects in a covert way. I think the approach needs to be, our communication strategy needs to be much better. And the years I've spent here in this country in ministering and sharing is really how demonstrating that we have got a social responsibility. And the project you described that I've done are clearly a demonstration of that social responsibility of the church. The incarnation of our vision. I feel that we could proclaim the prophetic, we can declare transformation, but there needs to be an incarnational aspect to the thing that we do. And the incarnational aspect needs to be much stronger.
Some would argue that the work, for example, what you've done and other churches is social welfare. It doesn't really hit on the head, as it were, social injustice.
But when you're dealing with a people who have been treated in an unjust way and a people who have been marginalized, because when we look at the attitude of superiority and being infected by the institution, the whole survival strategy of our people is the church has been carrying that responsibility. The church has been the area and the avenues and developed strategies, caring in various ways. So we have been caring for our people. And if we had not provided that, and the cohesion, the social ability, the social advancement, and the various other things has been done by our church. It's a partial society. We have been marginalized. And it is that marginalized, and the fact that we have engaged with others is that the strategy we have implemented is moving the church from the margins. But yet the institution will be determined that we'll keep the churches on the margin and keep Black people on the margins. This is the historical position. And I think in the question, in fact, I'll turn the question around. How do you help us to move from the margins? We have collected, and if you look at the history of our people being treated, our mortgages have been higher rates. We have been the worst jobs in our industries. Our children are treated poorly at school. How do we act in a way to remove ourselves from the margin? And the strategies that we have developed are moving our church from the margin. But yet many people who criticize our church of not participating in the wider community, have not realized that this strategy we have developed has enabled us to move from the margins into this, so that we are now delivering this lecture. 20 years or 30 years ago, we would never be invited to deliver this lecture. And that is a statement in itself.
Some would say you have enough autonomy not to be seeking, because it's as though you're asking for permission, inclusivity, as you mentioned earlier. Does African descent not have autonomy to do things for themselves?
We have done it for ourselves, but we are masters in our own houses. We are not tenants in our house. We feel confident enough to speak with boldness, and we can speak in the terms that we do without excuse or pardon, because we realize that we've been marginalized. We've been marginalized by the businesses, in schools, and all the institutions. And we are now educated. In fact, if you do a statistical analysis, you'll realize that the church is now middle class, largely middle class, professional middle class. And the danger is that we will become disconnected from the base that our parents were 30 or 40 years ago. So the necessity now is for us to maintain that connectivity and move from the margins. In fact, when we came from the Caribbean, most of our people were labor rights. They voted labor for several ones. How many of our people were ever adopted to be participate? And in fact, when you look at the industry, we see in many areas of industry, it was the very labor unions that kept our people on the margins. In other words, the worst jobs and the most dirtiest jobs in the factory were given to immigrants. The poorest paid job were given to the immigrants. If you look at our death rates, for example, and you look at my father and others, if you look at the age that they're deceased, our mortality, you'd find that is largely related to the jobs that they did. So this church, the black churches, has been the refuge, the strategy of sustaining, of mobilizing and enabling. And this is why, if you do statistically, our sense of achievement, our sense of accomplishment is far better than the average in the population of black people in the UK.
Another question that's coming through: colonialism has remained in its overt and covert forms because Christians, regardless of denomination, and the church per se, have only agreed to this deconstruction in principle, but not in practice.
But we have been, and let me say this, is that I've watched many Tarzan films when I was growing up. I watched many Indian films, and if we look at that, we were entertained with a conditioning on the colonialism. And I was said to my friends this evening, how many Tarzan films have you watched? How many with Indians and cowboys? How many of them have you watched? Did you enjoy them? And when I said it is not the church, it's the whole society, and we must acknowledge the fact that, and I think Bob Marley said it this way, we must liberate ourselves from mental slavery. Even now, as Caribbean, and even among us as Caribbean and others, if we are lighter complexion and the shape of our faces are different, we are referred to as being acceptable. But if you're black, it said, the Americans said it this way, stay back. And we know that's also a part of the Caribbean issue. And that is also part of the psychological consequences of slavery. And we are still, and as I mentioned to you earlier, that is not just about the Caribbean people. It's the people who are born here and people of Caribbean and European heritage. How do we resolve? There's a larger problem here. 1,000 upon 1,000 of people of mixed heritage still has that thing among us. So therefore, we all need help. We all need that sense of reconciliation in order to make a difference.
Well, on that thought there, you mentioned Bob Marley. Here we have someone saying, thank you for mentioning that. How might Marcus Garvey's views about self-determination help us as we go forward?
Marcus Garvey was a smart communicator, and Marcus Garvey realized that he could not stay in the Caribbean to advance his views. He needed to be on a world stage. He went to the United States and came to Britain. But Marcus Garvey was subverted by disinformation. If you look at Marcus Garvey his strategies was first the identity, and if you look at Rex Nettleton's work, largely an establishment of an identity and the decolonization. Marcus Garvey is part of his work. Industry, in other words, you must be creative. Enable yourself to be seen as a human being and be productive. And that must also be done on the world stage. He came to Britain, but the pre-decolonization period, he was misinformation. And let's use the current term, fake news was essentially used to weaken his position. And Marcus Garvey, and if you look even in Caribbean literature in the earliest form, he was seen as being a person who wasn't altogether there. It's latter years that he was rehabilitated and clearly seen, although our foreparents did in large numbers saw him as a global figure. Among Europeans, he was seen to be not a uncertain figure, but we now see him as a major reformer, a major figure of shaping a global view, and clearly his work is of merit.
I think I'm going to ask you the final question this evening, Bishop. In the last year, we were reminded by academic Vereen Shepherd, who told us a lot about women who have been absent in the narrative of Sam Sharpe. And I have to say to you, I was listening keenly for the mention of women. You didn't do that.
Now, let me say this. I use Sam Sharpe largely as a symbol. Not so as a man, yes, but as a symbol. But as I said, within the culture, within the particular Jamaica, within that culture, there has been a deeply embedded sense of resistance. And one of the person who led that resistance was a leader which called Nanny, who led the Maroons, and she was proactive. She was a general among the resistance leaders. I think an issue in this presentation is time. I had to move quickly, and I must say, if I have a critique about it, it's a huge subject, 300, almost 400 years, and to move at the pace that I'm given and in this webinar, I don't feel I've done justice to this subject. So, but clearly, it is not to be misunderstood that the feminine, the women were not present. They were very much a part of the struggle. Nanny was a leader. She was, in fact, I believe that she could be one of the national heroes in Jamaica. And if we are going to look at the widening the scope, we clearly should play. I think she's there. I'm correct myself. I think Nanny's there as a national hero. So therefore, when we speak about resistance in Jamaica, we see that origin of resistance. Clearly, Nanny what is there, and really was as prominent as Sharpe. So if it seems as if that the feminine element is missing, I'm sorry. It's because of the speed at which I've had to move. Sorry about that.
Thank you for addressing it, and indeed mentioning Nanny. Absolutely. Yeah. I want to say thank you for this year's lecture and the work that you put in, and we wish you well as a retired bishop, if there is such a thing, in the Church of God of Prophecy. And just remind everyone, this evening's lecture will be available to watch again shortly if you go on www.baptist.org.uk/Sam20. Thank you, Bishop.
Thank you, Dulcie. Thank you.
Okay. Come in now to share some final thoughts and to give a vote of thanks and to announce the 2021 Sam Sharpe Lecture. Let me introduce to you Revd Karl Johnson. Karl is an ordained Baptist minister of the Jamaican Baptist Union. He has served the Jamaican Baptist Union as both pastor and now general secretary. He's married to Yvette, and together they have 3 sons. And he joins us now from Jamaica. Hello, Karl.
Hi, Dulcie. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. And how is the weather in Jamaica?
Well, what I can say is that I enjoyed this lecture this year for one main reason. I am enjoying the weather in paradise. How is it there? How is the weather there?
Cold and dark.
Ah! The Lord certainly loves his children.
Thank you, Karl.
Good, good, good. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us in what will be viewed as one of the more unforgettable lectures in the Sam Sharpe series. Unforgettable because it took place during the year when the COVID-19 pandemic held the world in its grips. We had to make so many changes all over the world in how we organized ourselves, how we executed our affairs. And as you can well imagine, and might have picked up, the Sam Sharpe Lecture series did not escape having to make some adjustments. It is against that backdrop primarily why I would like to express deep appreciation and kudos to Mike Lowe and his technical team for providing the resources to facilitate the virtual staging of this year's lecture. To our able moderator, Dr. Dulcie McKenzie, we say thanks for so smoothly and skillfully and deftly navigating the evening's proceedings, especially the Q&A session. Many, many thanks to this year's lecturer, Bishop Wilton Powell, OBE, for your thought-provoking lecture, Bishop. We thank you. The Sam Sharpe Partners are appreciative of the amount of time you invested in preparing for this year's Sam Sharpe Lecture. And we could hear you lament the fact that you wanted more time. We are grateful for your thoughts and insights and reflections, and hope that your challenging words will enable women and men to stand up against the state. Speaking of Sam Sharpe Partners, I'd like to just refresh your memory for those who may not know who some of these are. And I single out for mention BMS World Mission, Baptist Together, Regent's Park College, the Jamaica Baptist Union, and of course, Rosemarie Davidson-Gotobed. I would like to say at this juncture that we couldn't close this evening's proceedings without saying a word of commendation to the planning team, which included the dynamic duo of Rosemarie and Wally Hudson-Roberts. Truly, they are akin to rock stars among us, and they are the ones who have done so much to ensure that these lectures take place every year for the past 9 years. Thanks again to all of you who attended this year's lecture, and we look forward to having you next year, as well as to those whom you will invite to come along with you next year. And the next year's lecture will be held on October 21. Please put that on your calendars, take out your smartphones and make the book that date from now. It will take place at the British Parliament, at the House of Commons, and the lecturer will be the Chief Executive Officer of Christian Aid, Amanda Khozi Mukwashi. We look forward to another stimulating lecture. That's it for now. Bye-bye. Cheers, as you say in the UK, or if you're where I am in Jamaica, where we say, big up yourself. Take care.